The city was covered in smoke and fire. The ground shook with every blast, and the sky was red with burning light. Walls had fallen and broken streets stretched out like scars. Men and women stood in lines with rifles in their hands. Their faces were dark with dirt, but their eyes were fixed with a strong will. They waited for the next wave of battle. Their queen stood on a rise in the middle of the ruins. She held a sword in her hand, and her voice carried over the chaos. She told her people that they would not bow, and that the ground they stood on was theirs. Her words lit fire in the hearts of those who heard her. They lifted their weapons higher and gave loud cries. An outsider stood apart from them at first. He'd come from far away and had seen many wars. In his mind, men and women were fragile and weak, but as he watched, he found himself drawn to them. He saw boys who should have been afraid stand in the open with steady hands. He saw girls who had lost their families still lift their weapons without fear in their eyes. They fought with more than strength. They fought with something he could not name. The outsider walked down into the broken streets. Smoke burned his throat and ash clung to his skin, but he kept moving until he stood close to the lines of men and women. One of the soldiers turned to him. His name was Jack. Jack was tall and thin, but he had a firm grip on his weapon. He looked at the outsider without fear and only asked if he was ready to fight. The outsider nodded. He did not speak many words, but he understood what was asked. He lifted his weapon and took his place beside them. The battle began again with sudden fire and sound. Buildings cracked apart and stones flew through the air. Men shouted and the queen raised her sword high. The outsider fought as he always had, with skill and strength. But he could not take his eyes off the humans around him. He saw a young girl named Claire run through falling rubble to carry supplies to the front line. He saw Matthew drag a wounded man back to safety while bullets struck the wall near his head. He saw Olivia stand on broken stone and fire again and again without lowering her aim. Each moment showed him something new. These people knew fear, but they did not fall to it. They held it in their hands and turned it into power. The outsider felt something stir within him as he fought. He had never seen courage like this. He had never stood among those who would not break even when the ground itself betrayed them. As fire rained down, he knew he had found something that would change him. He had stood with humans, and the meaning of fear was no longer the same. The night grew darker as the battle stretched on. Fires burned in the streets, and the smoke rose high over the broken city. The outsider moved with the soldiers and learned their names one by one. Jack kept close to him and showed him the path through the ruins. Olivia carried water and food to those who had no rest. Claire ran messages between lines of fighters and never slowed down, even when her legs trembled. Matthew worked to patch wounds with whatever cloth he could find. Sophie stayed near the queen and helped her carry supplies of weapons to the front. Each of them had a place, and none of them stopped. The outsider fought with them through each clash. He had thought men and women would be weak, but he saw strength in every act. They fought with fear in their eyes. Yet they did not let it rule them. When fire broke walls, they pulled each other from the rubble. When one fell, another stepped in to hold the line. Their voices carried over the roar of battle. They called out to each other and to the queen. They did not cry out in despair, but in unity. At night, when the battle slowed, the outsider sat with them near small fires. They shared food with him, though they had little for themselves. Jack spoke of his home and how he once worked with wood before the war. Claire told stories of the river where she used to swim with her brothers. Matthew said he dreamed of quiet fields where no sound of war could reach. Olivia smiled as she spoke of her younger sister who still waited for her return. Sophie said little, but her eyes were bright and steady as she kept her watch. These words made the outsider feel something he had never known. They lived with memories and hopes that burned as strong as their courage. The outsider listened and gave few words of his own, but he felt closer to them with each passing day. When the call to arms came, he rose with them without pause. The bond grew not from duty, but from choice. He began to see that his place was not apart from them, but with them. The queen came to the fire one night and spoke to them all. She thanked them for their strength and told them the great trial was near. The enemy would strike the capital with all their might. The walls were weak and the land broken, but she said the spirit of her people was stronger than stone. She told them to hold fast and never step back. Her words did not sound gentle. They were hard like iron, yet they gave light to all who heard them. The soldiers lifted their heads higher. Jack clenched his fists. Claire straightened her back. Olivia wiped the dust from her face. Matthew nodded with firm eyes. Sophie gripped her weapon close. The outsider felt the same fire rise within him. He knew then that the next battle would test them all, and he was ready to stand beside them. The morning of the final march came with a heavy sky. Smoke hung low, and the ground was black with ash. The outsider stood with the soldiers as the queen gave her command. The capital city was ahead, and it was the last shield for her people. The walls were broken and towers had fallen, yet she said they would not fall back. She raised her sword and told them that this day would decide their future. Her voice was steady and strong. The soldiers lifted their rifles and shouted as one. The march began. Jack walked at the front with his rifle tight in his hands. Olivia carried supplies on her back and kept close to the wounded who limped beside her. Claire ran ahead to send word between groups. Matthew pushed a cart with cloth and water for those who would need it soon. Sophie walked near the queen, her eyes sharp and ready. The outsider marched with them, his weapon at his side, his heart heavy but firm. He had fought in many wars, but never with men and women like these. When they reached the city, the battle rose at once. Fire struck the broken walls and stones crashed down. Men cried out, but none turned to flee. The queen lifted her sword high, and her voice rang clear. She called for her people to stand fast. Jack led a charge through the broken gate, and his shout carried over the roar. The outsider followed him and struck with all his power. Claire rushed through smoke to bring orders to the flanks. Olivia pulled the wounded to cover and gave them water with steady hands. Matthew dragged 2 men back, even as bullets struck near his feet. Sophie fired from the wall and did not lower her aim. The fight tore through the streets. Flames leaped from roof to roof, and the ground shook with blasts. The outsider saw fear in their eyes. Yet he also saw something greater. They did not hide from it. They stood taller, as if fear itself gave them strength. Jack was cut on his arm, but he pushed forward with his rifle. Olivia stumbled under the weight of a wounded man, yet she kept moving. Claire was covered in ash, but she still carried word to the queen. Matthew's hand shook as he tied cloth on wounds. Yet he never stopped. Sophie fought with fire in her gaze. The queen stood in the heart of it all, her sword flashing bright. She was not behind the lines, but in front, where the fight was hardest. The outsider struck again and again, yet he felt his heart pound with a new weight. He had never feared battle, but now he feared to lose the ones beside him. As fire and stone fell, he knew he would fight to his last breath to keep them standing. This was no longer a war for land or power. It was a fight for the bond he had found with them, and he swore he would not let it break. The night of the great battle came with fire lighting the sky. The city walls were broken, and the streets were filled with smoke and rubble. The outsider stood in the center of the storm with the humans around him. The queen raised her sword, and her voice carried across the ruins. She told them that this was the last stand and they must not break. Her words gave them strength, even as the enemy pressed hard against the gates. Jack charged forward with his rifle and shouted for the men behind him to follow. His arm was wrapped in cloth from the cut he had taken, but he showed no weakness. Olivia moved through the broken streets to pull the wounded out of the fire. Her hands were steady, and her eyes sharp as she gave water and kept them alive. Claire ran again and again through the smoke-carrying word between groups. Her hair was covered in ash and her face blackened with dust, yet her steps did not slow. Matthew worked without rest to bind wounds and drag men to safety. He bled from his own shoulder, but he would not stop. Sophie fired from the tower where the wall still stood, and her aim was true each time she pulled the trigger. The outsider fought with them, and each strike of his weapon was heavy and fierce. He had known many battles and thought fear was for the weak. But this night, he felt fear for the first time. He did not fear the fire or the stone. He feared the loss of those who now fought at his side. He feared to see Jack fall or to see Olivia crushed under rubble. He feared the silence if Claire no longer returned with her fast steps. He feared to watch Matthew drop from his wounds or Sophie fall from her tower. Most of all, he feared the queen struck down as she led them with her sword high. This fear was not weakness. It was a fire that burned inside him and made him fight harder. The queen herself came to the front lines. Her sword shone in the firelight as she cut her way forward. She fought beside her people, and each strike of her blade gave courage to those who saw her. The outsider looked upon her and felt the weight of his oath. He knew that if she fell, the spirit of her people would break. He swore that he would not let it happen. The fight lasted through the long night. Stones fell and towers burned, but the humans did not bend. Their voices rang out above the roar of battle. They shouted to one another and stood shoulder to shoulder. The outsider felt his heart pound with every step. He had discovered what true fear was, and he had found that it made him stronger. He fought not only for his life, but for the lives of those who had given him trust. He knew he could never turn away from them again. The dawn broke at last after the long night. Smoke still rose from the ruins and the ground was black with ash. The outsider stood with the humans who had survived. Their bodies were tired and their clothes torn, but their eyes still burned with the same fire as before. The queen stood among them, her sword stained and her face lined with dust. She looked over her people and spoke with a voice that carried through the silence. She told them they had stood firm and had won their future with their own strength. Her words brought pride to those who had lived and honor to those who had fallen. Jack leaned on his rifle, his arm still bound with cloth, yet he did not fall. Olivia moved through the rows of the wounded, her hands working without rest. She gave water to those who could barely lift their heads. Claire carried word of the victory to every corner of the city, her steps light even on broken ground. Matthew bound wounds with steady hands, though his own shoulder was marked with deep cuts. Sophie stood near the queen, her eyes sharp as ever, her weapon close at her side. Each one of them bore marks of the night, yet each one still stood ready. The outsider walked among them and felt the weight of what had passed. He had fought in many wars, yet never had he seen such strength. These men and women had not been without fear. He had seen it in their eyes as fire rained down and walls fell, yet they did not let it master them. They took fear into their hands and made it into courage. This truth struck his heart deeper than any blade. He had thought fear was weakness, but now he saw it as the root of their power. The queen came to him and placed her hand upon his shoulder. She told him he had fought with honor and had stood as one of them. She said he was no longer a part, but part of their people. The outsider bowed his head, not in shame, but in respect. For the first time, he felt that he belonged. The city was broken, but not defeated. People began to clear the streets and raise new walls. Fires were put out and the wounded were carried to shelter. Children came out from hiding and ran to the arms of those who had returned. Songs rose in the ruins, not of sorrow, but of strength. The outsider watched and knew that their spirit would never be broken. He looked at Jack, Olivia, Claire, Matthew, Sophie, and the queen. He knew that their bond had been forged in the hardest fire. I had found fear among them, but also the meaning of courage. He swore in his heart that he would never leave their side. As the sun rose higher, he stood with them, not as a stranger, but as one of their own. He had stood with humans and discovered real fear, and through it he had found his true place.